Welcome to day 3 and welcome to this session of intervention points and opportunities for collaboration. It's an ambitious session because during this session we are going to try and attempt to summarize, remind you of something about day 1 and also summarize day 2, which was a super intense, super long, and we will provide you an attempt of a map and a few selection of points in day 2. And then after that, I'm going to introduce you the 5 panelists, this is going to work in the following way. They're going to stand to sit. They're sitting right now in first row. They're going to stand and react to the initial attempt to map day 1 and day 2 and provide your contribution. It's a very diverse group of people coming from NGOs, from academia, from activists, and from foundations and from companies. So look forward to hearing from them. Then after their short interventions, I will open up to you and the survivors of last night that will provide your own ideas and comment and questions, because we are at a very interesting moment in these 3 days, because we already have put so much on the table. It's a wonderful opportunity to integrate, so provide your own point of view, to pose questions, of course, to the panelists, in general to the audience. And then we will close the session, again going back to the 5 panelists for a short reaction. Maybe you pose the questions to them, or maybe they want to add something to what we heard in this approximately 1 hour of this session. So let's get started. Please, the slides. Okay, this slide was already shown to you yesterday morning by Urs, and it was, I will just show it to you without going into detail. You've already seen it, but it just may be helpful to have a quick reminder of what we discussed in day 1, so something from the keynotes and something from the discussions during the day. That informed what happened in the following day, which is yesterday. And after this reminder, let me try to provide you with an attempt to capture at least some of the amazing discussions of yesterday. So consider the following slides, of course, as a selection. It's not exhaustive, otherwise it would have been like 120 slides at the least. So it's a selection, and it tries to provide a map of the discussions yesterday. So the first part is to notice that different types of solutions and different types of problems, sometimes we could cluster them by concept, very abstract concepts like transparency, access, bias, etc. And you heard that a lot during the day. In other cases, maybe less frequently, but in other cases, technologists like me, we're talking about specific technical issues like specific kind of data or specific algorithms. And that's another way of clustering the discussions yesterday. And finally, we heard quite a bit, and that's another way of clustering the solutions and the ideas, different moments, different stages in the process. Some discussions were focusing on contribution, focusing a lot on the inputs, for instance, of the process, other on the outputs, and so that's another way of clustering. The second map that I would like to share with you is that we were handling and discussing very different timescales. In some cases, people were saying, it's already late now, we have to act immediately because otherwise it's too late. In other cases, we were saying, especially academics like me, were saying, wait a second, in order to provide thoughtful answers and thoughtful evidence, we need time. In some cases, years. And we need both. And so many conversations can be analyzed looking at the timescales of the discussion. And one specific issue that brings the topic of timescales is the analogy with the global movement about the environment that we heard yesterday and also on the first day. And of course that means timescales which tend to be long because it's a movement that is still not comparable to the environmental movement, and also brings another dimension which is not timescale but is geographical. Global versus local, as you see in the last line of this second block. Finally, in this selection of potential maps and compasses, we discussed a lot, as is usually the case, about interdisciplinarity. It's generally an important topic that comes up often when we discuss of digital issues. But I would argue that we can make a case that in the case of AI, whichever way you want to define it, is even more important. Because we bring up issues that are clearly outside the purely technical domain, like values, for instance. And therefore, and that's, take it as my own personal contribution, I'm a computer engineer, and so I was thinking aloud with other colleagues, maybe in the curricula for computer science and computer engineer, we should make a much stronger case for an education in, of course, a partial education in humanities and social sciences for computer scientists, more specifically tied to the problems raised by AI, and maybe mandatory rather than elective, as is usually the case in many colleges and universities. And then, besides interdisciplinarity, the need for dialogue, as usual among different stakeholders, which is something that we've discussed so many times in these years in our domain. But let me also add about different professions. Maybe we can make a case that we can remind ourselves that professions have a profound role in our society that has been weakening in the last decades, and maybe we can bring back their role, different kinds of professions, the professors, the diplomats, the lawyers, the doctors, etc. And therefore we heard, for instance, talking about diplomats, which is a profession, and saying they were discussing AI without having the proper base knowledge to discuss the topic. So maybe we can also think about involving professional organizations and contribute to a more intense debate among professions. Now, open questions, drivers, and applications. This is a super arbitrary selection of the many things that happened yesterday. And so you will see that, for instance, came up maybe the need for a definition of AI, maybe a legal definition of AI. And let me tell you, from the technical point of view, as a computer scientist, sometimes I had the fear that AI is stretched to cover almost anything. And that, of course, is the end of the definition, because otherwise, if it's everything, then it's nothing. So we have to be a bit more careful. Then, how do we find values in AI context? When the very title of this conference, talking about inclusion, of course, brings up from the very beginning the idea of values. And since this conversation was so wonderfully representative of many different points of view and also of many different geographical areas, of course, values have different meanings in different contexts. And one thing that came up, and I personally witnessed it in the conversation yesterday, is that maybe it's a chimera to think about debiasing or being completely neutral. Some people were saying it's a total chimera. It's impossible to be unbiased. There is always bias. And so maybe we should strive, rather than debiasing, we should strive to make explicit what are the values, what do we mean by the values, what are our biases, what are our objectives. Third point, what is an ethical best business model for big tech? What are appropriate remedy, and we heard several potential interesting solutions for that. And finally, the algorithms, transparency of the algorithms, auditing of the algorithms. So how do we audit algorithms, like in the case of machine learning techniques that are not the traditional if-then-else kind of algorithms? And so there is active research also in computer science to shed some light on the workings of this algorithm, therefore making it possible to audit them. And then the usual very old question of who are the proper auditors? So who is the custodian of the custodians? And then finally, do we want a recipe? So in other words, do we want a transparency on the algorithm and that's it? Or do we want also a more comprehensive understanding of the so-called health effect in this metaphor with the medicine? Or both? Probably my personal position is that definitely we want both. Okay, super selection of potential questions that came out yesterday. Then, like in day 2, like yesterday, we have assembled a number, again, non-exhaustive, but we hope representative, of action items that came out yesterday from creating, leading, facilitating interdisciplinary coalitions or platforms, the creation of data commons that you heard yesterday, open source requirements, how to sustain the participation and the influence of the Global South in these discussions, the network of centers' potential role in all these, etc., etc. I will not go over all of them, but it's just to give you an idea of what we have collected with our note-taking and our thinking. So let me underline and remind you 4 case studies from the Global South and underserved voices that struck the attention of the audience. So maybe I think it's definitely worth it to go through them again. We heard the Desabafo Social in Brazil and its powerful message that algorithms shape reality. And you can actually do something about it in some cases, like in the cases that they presented. The case of the troubling case of background check information in Iran, so to be aware of how a certain technology apparently created for specific, apparently innocuous objective can have troublesome uses. Weather forecasting and diagnosis prognosis in Uganda and worries about human and data security in that case. And then the fairly well-studied and well-known cases of disparity of service in the case of Uber, also Airbnb. Okay, and so let's remind about these cases and let's keep our eyes open, and also as a researcher, let's keep studying these cases in order to make it more well-known and understood worldwide. Now, let me conclude before I turn to our panelists with a few personal thoughts, if I may, something I've heard or something that I thought, or a combination of both. What is actually new and what is not new? It's a usual question, but I think it's particularly important for AI. Sometimes I was thinking when I was listening to the discussion, okay, this specific problem, it could have been posed 10 years ago exactly in the same way, even though the technology at the time was not called AI. So maybe we can, I say that not for being skeptical, but because maybe we can learn. Maybe there is already methodologies and approaches and studies that can help us to understand problems that we think are completely new, but actually with a slight rephrasing or a slight reframing are actually old. And also avoiding the extremes, avoiding the typical, oh, everything is going to be completely changed and disrupted. We already heard that before. And also, everything is going to be catastrophic and the civilization is about to end. Let's avoid both. We know that are both untrue, which is exactly the point about avoiding everything will change both in the positive and the negative sense. Third point, as an engineer, I was reading reports, including the wonderful IDRC draft report that was given to us a few days before coming to the conference. I kept thinking, maybe there are a lot of forecasts, but extremely hazy forecasts. And maybe we can make a step forward trying to have a more precise definition of what is success in different domains. So let's discuss about specific AI application, and then let's define together what is success. Is this 10% improvement, 20, 30% improvement? And secondly, the time scale. Is this success happening in 6 months or next year or in 5 years? It makes a huge difference. So maybe it could be worth it, case domain by domain, trying to be to agree on a definition of success and a time scale, and then use it as a reference and to go back in 6 months or 1 year and trying to assess what's going on with AI. So that's what I mean by thresholds and timing. And finally, I think you all agree with me that the conversation in this last couple of days and today in Rio has been unique. Let me use this word unique because I attended many meetings that in some sense potentially similar to this one, but this to me is unique because the breadth of point of views and experiences that I personally heard, I never heard it this way, and this is an amazing accomplishment of the organizers. And so therefore, the question immediately is like, I want this to last. I don't want it to be an event, a point in time that leaves beautiful memories. It's already something, it's already important, but I wonder whether, and I pose it truly as an open question to you and to the panelists, how can we sustain this? Is there a way where we can sustain this inclusive, extraordinary conversation? Okay. That's it. That's the summary, and I thank you, all the crew, for providing me with all the wonderful notes, for making this recap. And this presentation is also the basis for the point of departure for the interventions of the panelists and also from you, from the audience. The panelists will, if they want, react to this or add their own point of view or contribution. It's completely up to them. So let me turn to them, and let me invite Alison Gillwald from the Research ICT Africa Network, based in South Africa. And if you want to stand there and give you the microphone.
Thank you.
Do you want to stay here? Okay.
Should I? Oh,
sure.
It's okay. Good morning, everyone. I am from Research ICT Africa, which is a public interest think tank on policy and ICT policy and regulation, with a membership across 20 countries in Africa. But I'm also based at the University of Cape Town in the Graduate School of Development Policy and Practice. So some of the points I'm making are really to the academy and as a critique of the academy, and some are around trying to build an informed evidence base for policy in this area. So the first, obviously there's too much to comment on all of them. So I thought what I would just speak about were two areas, mainly around the need for serious and genuine transdisciplinary research and proper engagement with that, not just sort of lip service to us needing to do it. And then also to look at the problems of data we have and how that impacts on biasing, participation, inclusion, etc., in relation to AI. But some of the broad points I want to make really relate to the point you were making about what is new and what isn't new about AI, and really the complexity of the environment that we're in, the locating of artificial intelligence in the ICT ecosystem, and not as something in a sort of linear, and we've kind of gone through all these things and we're now at AI, but understanding it in the ICT ecosystem, because really that explains the multiple systems, the multiple levels of governance, global and national, etc., that you have to have in order for the inclusion of people throughout the world. So part of that complexity really requires that we engage critically with other disciplines. So I think particularly in the area of ICT4D, in the area of technology, and often called society, there's not a critical engagement with a lot of the other things. If we're talking about using AI for development, we need to critically understand development. We need to critically engage with SDGs, not just use them because they've been agreed by a whole lot of member states, etc. What are the problems? What are the challenges there? Critically, engage with the language of multilateral agencies, because that is our job as the academy, is to engage with that critically and in a public interested way, in an independent way, to cut across some of the very vested interests that exist in the funding of research in this area and in the absence of funding of research in this area. And so even things like, the fourth industrial revolution, it's used in a very uncritical sense. From a political economy sense, this is just a late phase capitalism, advanced capitalism. The contradictions that we're seeing around automation and unemployment are simply the contradictions of that kind of, economic and political development. There's nothing to suggest that there is a fundamental shift either in the technology or the power relations or anything else that, sorry, I've lost my note here, that distinguish this from, from an earlier phase of development. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly see if I can find it again, otherwise I'll just talk without it. Seem to have lost it here. Okay, so the other point I just wanted to make quite quickly was, so we need to interrogate these issues. If we look at things at the assumptions that are behind a lot of the paradigms for AI is actually the assumptions are that we've got mature, regulated markets that people are able to enjoy consumer choice in, and that there's innovation. Whereas, in fact, if we look at the impact on AI, or the effect of AI, or the potential impact of AI on less developed countries, we see a very different scenario. So the manifestations that are there, I'm not suggesting that the manifestations that are spoken about in the Fourth Industrial Revolution aren't there in mature economies, but they firstly don't play out in the same way because of the uneven nature of capitalism and the uneven development across the continent, the ability to harness the benefits of globalization. In undeveloped economies, you simply don't get some of the same manifestations. So, for example, perhaps the concerns around automation in underdeveloped countries are not such a problem because we're unindustrialized. And so we're not going to lose those kinds of jobs. Just coming very quickly to the issues of data, I just wanted to speak about the complementary needs. So in the complementary disciplinary area, the complementary multi-stakeholder area, but in the area of data, we need to use complementary data. Because developing countries and African countries that I'm particularly concerned with are marginalized from big databases, from the collection of public statistics, etc. We need to look at how we need to continue to do conventional demand-side research, which is the only way you can actually identify the points of policy intervention in prepaid mobile markets. You cannot get it from the supply-side data, and you need to actually go and speak to people. Sensors, AI sensors, mobile phones don't actually tell you if that person is a man or a woman, if they're poor or if they're rich, etc. So we need to do this complementary data. And only by increasing not only the access, because I think it's really important that we move from just connectivity to the usage, the intensity of use, the ability, the demand side, the capabilities aspects of being able to use that data, that we're going to be able to even be represented in the big data, in the big data analytics. So I mean, that really raises the need to nuance notions of marginalization. All marginal people aren't the same, so I raised the importance that was raised around intersectionality, the need to understand marginalization. There are people who are a little bit marginalized, there are people who are a lot more marginalized, there are people who are never going to come online, and how do we address those from a more demand-side public interest point of view than the current commercial appropriable returns kind of models that we've got that have provided enormous services in underdeveloped countries, but will still never be able to meet be delivered at a cost that the majority of people can afford. So we need to nuance that. We need to use data in a complementary way. And this is where I think artificial intelligence can be used to supplement weak institutions, weak governments, weak data gathering in order to plan better for development, by whatever you mean by that, economic growth, etc. But that will require levels of regulation that are very often not present in the kind of internet and open domain and thing. So it might require that we regulate algorithms, that we get transparency, that we get open data. And I know this is very problematic because in many countries our states are repressive, our states are not functional democracies, etc. So the idea of the state getting more control, having access to your data, etc., are of course of major concern. But I think in these discussions there tends to be an absence of understanding or acceptance of the need for some public regulation, a role of the state, even if it's only an enabling role for the state, to allow the industry to take off and allow these incredible technological developments.
So thank you, and I invite Chinmayi, Arun. You can speak from there if you want, or you can come here, up to you. From the Center for Communication Governance in Delhi, you've heard and seen her already before during this conference.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here because we were one of the very early members of the network of centers. I'm quickly going to tell you about the hats that I wear just because it's a particular hat that I'm speaking from today. Mixed metaphors, though this might be. So I'm an assistant professor of law at National Law University, Delhi, where I set up and have run the Center for Communication Governance since 2012. And I'm going to talk to you today not as an assistant professor of law and a researcher that is interested in AI, but more as a person that has built one institution within India in the Global South to deal with the new issue of the internet governance and what it means, and as a director of a center that very early on got to be a part of this global network of centers and has seen the potential that it brings to the table. And so from that point of view, I thought that what I'll do today is not discuss the substance. You've heard quite a lot of it all day, and I feel like the appropriate place sometimes to discuss the brass tacks can be the academic conferences, many of which I'm sure that we will share and that we will meet at. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts. One is I'm going to tell you what I was expecting when I came here, and then I'll tell you what I heard, and finally I will give you what you might call my 2 cents. We call it my 2 paise in India. And so I'm beginning basically with, see, I was lucky enough that this is a conference organized entirely by my very dear friends. It's the Global Network of Centers meets Berkman Klein Center meets ITS Rio. And so I knew that it would be a wonderful, energetic, interdisciplinary room full of people that really understood what they were working with, but that are also capable of constructive engagement with each other. So I was expecting all of that. The second thing, which I'm sure that many of you noticed, is that there is a special signaling to holding an event like this in the Global South, in Rio and in Brazil. We've been talking about how to make the Global South central to debates, and this is very much one way in which it can be done. Now, in terms of what I heard, the day, it's been really interesting because most of the time I live in this law and regulatory theory silo. And this conference has brought together not only interdisciplinary academics, but also funders, people who are actually working with technology, people that are in the habit of building institutions, building out programs around the world. And I feel like the way in which they have been talking to each other is really interesting. And I say this because the takeaways that have emerged involve a lot of people that are sitting in this room. So the very first morning, the session that I moderated, Kathleen brought up something that to my mind was really valuable, which is that she said that if you want to integrate the Global South in debates about AI, the way to do it is to invest, right? And over time, I have seen people expand what we mean by invest. Yesterday, I heard someone make the distinction between the long-term solutions, the research, the building of expertise, and the more immediate solutions. Juan Carlos also highlighted this today. The need to react immediately, but also the capacity to be able to do so. I think that that's something that we really want to keep in mind as we figure out what to do here. And then moving on from there, my 2 paise is basically, so what do we do? And the reason that I'm talking about this from a more director of a center hat point of view is that I feel like a lot of the pieces to the puzzle, they are in this room. We've worked on this before in the context of internet governance. To give you examples, when my center started, there wasn't a lot of teaching on internet governance. I find that after 6 years, when I'm looking back at what happens when you fund a center in the Global South, build out not just academic programs, but also programs that are able to engage with policy, you build a pool of people that I am now meeting at conferences. I'm meeting my former students working in various institutions, speaking both the language of the global north, which is necessary for engagement at the global level, but also from a point of view that understands our local context. And so when I say invest, I mean not just in parachuting in expertise, but in helping the Global South build something out that is consistent with its own point of view. And I say this not just in the spirit of diversity is good and, oh, we should include the Global South, but from the point of view that in global debates and in the framing of norms, the Global South has always brought in ideas that have been central to the building out of human rights. So for example, introducing gender in the human rights treaties, that was actually an Indian foreign policy representative that proposed it. If you see the negotiations for the TRIPS and the WTO, similarly, you'll see that the Global South has made very valuable contributions. So I would say that definitely invest. And the last one is that I feel like this presents a great opportunity, both in terms of very constructive things that can be done with AI, helping the Global South learn much more than just about AI, but also in putting our heads together and building out the solution. We're never going to have one sort of ready to go today, but we can put it together, I think, over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chinmayi. Now we have Maria Paz Canales, Derechos Digitales in Chile, Executive Director. So,
thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I have the privilege to be the first one that will probably summarize this wonderful symposium from a different point of view, from the point of view of the more activist organization. My organization is Derechos Digitales, as Juan Carlos mentioned. Chilean-based organization, but we work in Latin America in all issues related with human rights and technology. So from that point of view, the first thing that I want to stress, it's my agreement to this call for the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, and particularly to bridge the separation that many times happen, unfortunately, between the academic work and the activism work. We have our own capacities of research, but many times we are short in the resources and the capabilities in-house to conduct really deep research that allows us to have enough data to be really effective in the advocacy policy work that we want to conduct. So I really celebrate this kind of conference in which we have opportunity to have more conversation, to enlarge the network of connection with the academic world in a way that we can try to envision how we can continue working together for the future to solve this really problematic question about how technology is evolving. The second point that I want to make, it's like a reaction of what Juan Carlos was presenting in his own summarize of the main ideas of these days. It's related to what is success. From the activism point of view that I mentioned at the beginning, for me, success in the field of AI is related with arrive to an agreement, a general consensus about the urgent need of a full human rights assessment in the decision-making of moving forward in developing this kind of technology, in the decision-making in the design of this technology, and in the decision-making of the implementation of this technology. And when I am pointing out to this, I want to go further to just the privacy issues that usually are on stage when we talk about artificial intelligence. This is not just a matter about to try to reset the current rules about privacy or data protection frameworks or how to access to more data about how we are being in some way put in a box for this new technology that is the artificial intelligence, but it's more about how we try to find the values to design, to implement this technology that preserve the dignity of human beings. So it could be completely artificial and completely machine-driven, the technology, but at the end, the only purpose that it has is to serve human beings, to serve us. So we need to reposition that in the analysis and not only the economical advantage that can have the implementation of artificial intelligence, but in the perspective of making really useful for achieving a better and fulfillment of the human rights. In the same line, I want to say that what is new? That was another question that Juan Carlos was presenting to us. What is new? I think that fundamentally new in the artificial intelligence issue, it's the problem of the scale. And the problem that it's everywhere. Potentially, it's a tool that can, in some way, affect everyone, everywhere, and without really knowing that what is going on. So, but there is also a data implication that go further to the traditional concept of data management that we have. It's not only related to the things that are directly useful to identify person, but a lot of implication on deriving conclusions about behaviors, about population, about tag to certain groups that are being made in a way that is totally different on which we have been done in the history of humanity. So I want to conclude just to how I see the possible solution for this, that of course I'm not going to find here, and probably we will not do it in just a symposium, even it's a very valuable opportunity to do this brainstorming. And I think that the key issue is to try to find new methodologies to build this need of fairness. As Juan Carlos was pointing out, there is no possibility of de-bias artificial intelligence, but we can build a way to make it more fair and more reasonable, and we need a methodology that stresses the way in which people can have an opportunity to participate in creating these values. This will be the really inclusive artificial intelligence, and for that, I think we need to learn a lot of the movements that were going on before in consumer field, in environmental field, as have been mentioned before, even in labor field. And from there, we can have valuable lessons on how to plug certain instances of more democratic decisions about the values that are inserted in the artificial intelligence. But for that, we also need to burst the bubble, not just being the same people that we are here, but communicate this message at large to our fellow citizens in our countries, especially in the global south, so they can understand there is an urgent need to pay attention to this now and not leave it for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Paz. Now, different point of view. Vera Franz, Deputy Director of Open Society Foundations. I'll give you my mic in a second, just presenting you.
Hi, everybody. I'm, as Carlos said, Vera, and I'm working with the Open Society Information Program. So I want to pick up on Maria's point on bursting bubbles, because I think that is a very, very good approach. And I want to speak about 5 fields or movements I think we need to connect with to make progress on this issue. Some of them obvious, but the first one, social justice community. I think it was really, all of us were touched by this Desabafo Social yesterday, and Carlos brought it up as well, because it really sort of connects and shows where the injustice lies in a very compelling way. And I think we need many more stories of this type. It's not always as easy to explain the bias as it is in this case, because it's very directly visible. So in some other instances, probably many of you are familiar with the work that Julia Ongwin at ProPublica did. She basically demonstrated there is racial bias in the risk scores for recidivism. Basically, in the United States, judges use a tool to determine the likelihood of reoffending. This is used to determine bail, early release, and sentencing. And she showed there is a racial bias. And exposed that, I think, and that took a year, so it is a lot of work to showcase this bias, but I think much more of this type of work needs to be done. And only then, I think, can we also change the discourse. So I was quite impressed to hear that, I think in India, most stories are positive about AI, not only was it 4 or something that are critical. So I think we need to invest much more into these investigations, and they need to be, of course, interdisciplinary. So bringing together investigative journalists, data scientists, researchers like yourself, and then also extract from these examples what are the policy recommendations. And that's where I think a lot of you come in. Again, in the Desabafo Social, it's pretty straightforward. It's search results need to reflect the population, right? That is the ask. And then on some other more complex cases, of course, the demands are a bit more complex. But again, we have smart policy people in this room, and that's where I think some of the efforts need to be focused. The second field or movement, which I know some of you are part of as well, is the intellectual property, or rather access to knowledge movement. So we talked, I think Mark Sorman yesterday talked about the data commons and how we need to sort of potentially think along those lines to create sort of data sets that can be used by everybody and not just private companies, but also this idea of patent pools and how can we sort of take this idea and use it in this space. So a patent pool basically is a consortium of players agreeing to cross-license patents, and in this case it could be to cross-license data, right? And of course the question is, what's the incentive for a big player like Google to do this and join such a pool? I think it's probably more attractive to smaller companies. But again, it's an idea that all of you who have worked on IP and A2K are very familiar with, and sort of what's the applicability of this idea in this field. Third is open government data movement. So I think we also heard in this conference that, for example, the digital corpus of the European Parliament, and I think the Canadian Parliament, is being used for very interesting project to create voice recognition, etc. So again, there's a whole movement out there, the open government data movement. It's probably now 10, 15 years old or so. And so it's, you know, probably worth having a conversation with them about what are some of the use cases. So what data have they liberated in the past 10, 15 years, and what are some of the use cases for these data sets? Two more, and then I'm done, and I'll be very quick with the last two. You know, a lot of this is about, I agree with Alison, late capitalism playing out. So really like confronting the power of the powerful, and how do we do this? And I think one other interesting tool is antitrust. We've recently convened, one of our partners has convened a meeting of competition authorities in Latin America to explore how to use the competition laws here vis-a-vis these platforms. There's quite some action, as you know, in Europe, and in the US, there is a seed of hope around antitrust, I think, especially if the Democrats will get to power in the future again. Lastly, this has come up in a session on data infrastructures as well. This is, as Alison called it, late capitalism, structural inequalities, and I was surprised that not once did I hear during this whole week the Paradise Papers. So, you know, a lot of the powerful AI producers and sort of platforms are obviously sort of using tax havens. So, and again, there's a whole field out there fighting for tax justice, and as some of these players avoiding taxes, I think it worth also connecting with that movement around tax justice in how, again, to confront the power of these huge internet platforms and the future owners of AI. Thank you very much, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Vera. And Victor Akinwande, from IBM Research Africa, based in Nairobi, if I'm not wrong. Please.
Thank you, Carlos. It's been an exciting event. My name is Victor Akinwande. I work in the healthcare team at IBM Research Africa in Nairobi. And I'll just talk a bit about some of the things that I've learned in course of this event, and some of the key takeaways and some of the ideas that have really struck me. For me, the biggest pain point when it comes to matters of AI and inclusion is capacity and education, because coming from a developing country, I strongly believe that we need to deviate from a consumerism approach and move to a point where we're less at the risk of Western imperialist values trumping our own cultures. And this is very important because it puts us at a fragile position when we need to negotiate things that have to do with issues of data governance and data ownership. And it also makes us have to fight to encode our own ethical values. And as my colleague mentioned, the global north and everyone really needs to invest and ensure that this capacity is actually developed. Another thing that really struck me over the course of the event is the need for us to debunk the binary narratives. And this is important as well in the global south because I can speak for Nigeria. policymakers, they don't really, their views are shaped largely by the narratives that they read and the narratives that they hear. So it's important for experts to put out their objective, in my opinion, objective, but skeptical optimistic narratives about beneficial artificial intelligence, and this also needs to be done more and more by people from the global south. Thirdly, I would also like to see more and more discussions around the impact and influence of AI on society, in the long term and also in short term. And we also need to see how we can encourage more people to be critical about their use of artificial intelligence. I was speaking with a colleague from Costa Rica and mentioned that young people, like they readily accept these technologies and they don't really think critically about what the impact of these technologies is. We need to encourage more people to think critically about applications of AI in their society. Another thing I would like to mention is the need for, a lot of the discussions here have spoken about how important an interdisciplinary approach is, and we can't overemphasize that. Basically, we need to expose engineers. I come from a technical background. We need to expose engineers to ethics as part of their training. I think it's very, very important. It's also helpful, as was mentioned yesterday, to have a shared understanding of the various interdisciplinary issues. Sociologists, politicians, technologists, we all need to have this common ground, basically. So true interdisciplinary is key, as you mentioned. Another thing I'd like to mention is garbage in, garbage out, as we're familiar with it in computer science. The least we can do is to demand that developers of artificial intelligence systems prove that the input to their systems are representative and very inclusive. In my opinion, I think the way forward for collaboration, in line with this session, is the way forward for AI should be guided by collaboration. And again, we need a multi-stakeholder approach to have meaningful debates about this issue. And my final thought is about the Global South and the need for us to stop taking a backseat, in my opinion, and widen aggressively our participation in AI. And I'll end with a quote by Abraham Lincoln, where he said, achievement has no color. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for these thoughtful, interesting contributions. Now, we have approximately 10 minutes for the audience, which I'm glad to see has increased in size, slowly coming back. Good, welcome, and about 10 minutes, and I recommend that you try to address either questions to the audience or short comments that can help to have a richer conversation, please.
It's freezing in here, and anything you could do about it would be greatly appreciated. Something that I find a bit disturbing about this discussion is something that's missing, which is the discussion of autonomy. Usually when we interact with technologies, we have some modicum of control over how we interact with them. I feel like with AI, I'm a participant in the Hawthorne experiments. Remember that? Everyone know what I'm talking about? Where workers were observed, how productive they were, and when they worked under light, they were more productive. And I feel that way about my own interaction with AI because I don't know when I'm interacting with AI. I mean, obviously now I know I'm interacting with when I use Siri, or when I, use Google search, or when I use, if I did use Lyft or Uber. But I think in general, we don't know when we're interacting. And so that's why I think the question of autonomy is so important. I also feel a little bit that this discussion about inclusion ignores, to some extent, the human right. I wish we would think about this to some extent more from a human rights perspective. And what I mean by that is just, is this empowering us to meet our potential, or is it at times undermining our ability to meet our potential. Sorry for that elaborate.
No, thank you. Thank you. Yes, over there.
It's on. It's on. Thank you very much. I think I want to thank Chinmayi for reminding all of us that in the end, this is all about leadership. It's all about the diversity within each one of us, that when we wear different hats, we also know we attend events under different contexts and capacities. And in that case, thank the organizers, in particular Carlos, Leonardo, and of course Uaz and the Bachman teams for bringing the diversity people we are into this room. Some of us who come from the right sector, if we are left with some of the corporations, the kind of productive discussions and engagements that have taken place in the last 3 days wouldn't take place. I think we start off as antagonists. And so when we meet under this environment with this leadership, it's really good because we take away lots of constructive and positive. So Chinmayi, thank you for reminding us about that. And at the end, after all, I want also to appreciate the fact that the network is growing. We are talking of inclusion. When we met for the first time at the Bachman Center, I was the only person who came from, who was black, and I was worried. Now when I get so many Kenyans in this room today, Kenyans alone, and then Africans, inclusion has been achieved to a very large extent, and also the global south is happening in place in Rio. So I think going forward, it can only get better. So thank you, Chinmayi, for reminding us that we take more aggressive leadership role in growing the network to make it better for the rest of society. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there is a hand here. I think, okay. Please remember to introduce yourself at the beginning.
Hi, I'm Shaz Jameson from Tilts in the Netherlands. I wanted to raise the question about education and capacity building. We've come back to this point a lot about how to help solutions emerge from the South and be more inclusive globally, that we need education and capacity building on a technical level. Great, that's not a discussion. But Victor, you said that for engineers we need to teach social science and teach ethics. And my question is that some of my colleagues at Tilt are doing this. They are in engineering master's degrees trying to teach ethics, and it is incredibly hard to say, why is this relevant? And to carry across that message about basically, if your intention is to build something that will go to Silicon Valley and, make $1 million or whatever, why should we care? And I think I'd like to, if anybody has any suggestions, I'm very happy to hear it, particularly about methodology, is rather than talking in the abstract of what we need, but how to make this concrete and actually carry it forward. I think that's something we need to still address, particularly as a network. Thank you.
I think that this obviously, for me, is perhaps one of the most inclusive conferences I've been to, and since I'm mostly traveling in Asia, then for me that was a really great opportunity to engage with the Global South. I think that this has been achieved and it's pretty remarkable, but we still have a really long way to go, because oftentimes we talk about values that everyone in this room agrees with, but the minute you bring them out into other countries, they're not going to agree with us. And we need to bring these disagreements into this room and talk about this. Because, for example, I had breakfast this morning with Nagla, and we were talking about democratizing AI. And we said, oh, democratizing AI is so great. And I said, yeah, but I have no idea how to translate it into Chinese. So the sense that, we all agree that there are common values that are not shared by a lot of people who are very prominent in the development of AI. And I think that another thing that for me was missing is kind of the strategic map of understanding which countries are going to be very influential and what are the points in which we need to engage with these people and how. I think that there was a lot of emphasis on building cohesion here, which is fantastic, but we are missing out on a pretty significant part of the world. I mean, Asia is home to over half of the world's population, and we do have India, which is fantastic, but it does not represent a lot of the countries in East Asia that do have that progress, and I think that this is perhaps a goal that the network could aspire to. This is obviously my first time interacting with you, so I don't have a lot of information about what happened so far, but I'm thoroughly impressed, and I feel like if you achieve this, I can only imagine what you can achieve if you go on and set that as a goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. A comment to Shaz's question on how how to insert social science values in the education of future technology makers. And I'm borrowing from the proposals of both paths on inserting values into technologies, and Vera to connect with more communities from the perspective of previous examples on internet governance and DRM standardization. We've been able to explain what was fair use or what were the different values to be respected when we went to public forums of international standardization, and it seems that there's not such there are no such bodies for the development of AI, or maybe Juan Carlos or other computer scientists, you would be aware of which IEEE conference is the key global international arena on where to connect not only with the students, but with the professors who are currently developing technologies.
Thank you. One more question.
So I'll just go really, really quickly and just, sorry, this is really loud. Echo what Alex said. I'm so honored truly to be here and to have been part of these few days. One issue that I think did not come up is actually the environmental and physical resource toll of AI. And then it's sort of, I think you spoke about this yesterday in your talk, but I'm not sure. Right, like the cloud is not actually a cloud. It takes energy and minerals from the ground, and that, of course, is feeding into climate change, which we know affects more vulnerable populations than others. So I just think in the future it would be great to sort of tie those concerns into some of our conversations.
Thank you so much. If you allow me, in the interest of time, unless there is a burning question for one of the panelists, to go back to them. But before going back to them, asking them a tweet, the long tweet, so you can use 280 characters if you want. But let me react, because it's really my field, to the comment about engineers and education of engineers. And because I'm an engineer, a computer engineer, and I'm involved also in the rethinking of the curricula in my own university. And I think that it's complex because we have to remind, first of all, that universities are not only for training professionals, but also to educating citizens, and that has been largely absent in many European universities, is stronger in the US. And the second point is that if we remind engineers that they're also professionals, as I was mentioned at the beginning, the idea that they are professionals, what is a professional, what are the duties of a professional, that's maybe the easiest entry point then to talk about ethics and their role in society, I think. Okay, let's go back to our panelists for a final very quick round. Alison, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that it's sort of as if we expect certain things to be happening online when they're not even happening offline. So, you know, whether it's human rights or whether it's, you know, connectivity or access, we sort of, you know, expect there to be open data, there's open government, whatever it is, when it's, you know, there's repression or, you know, not a failure to exercise rights. So I just wanted to sort of flag that, because I think we keep coming back to the same problems because these are fundamental developmental challenges that we're facing. And I just wanted to say, in terms of learning from other areas, which I think is absolutely critical, and I think everybody's emphasized that, is that some of these intersections require different kinds of responses. So if we take the commons, for example, the commons have really developed in terms of the data commons, in terms of Creative Commons licensing, etc., even copyleft, in some ways in opposition to formal systems. So they've become formal systems, but they've actually developed in opposition to those. Whereas other kinds of commons, which I would also suggest is a way of addressing inequalities and social exclusion and social justice issues, in the area, for example, of infrastructure commons, really require state participation. And so you've really got to sell the idea of the, you can't get open spectrum, and open spectrum would allow a whole lot of people who can't get services through commercial things to access unlicensed spectrum, possibly to innovate, possibly to create AI, etc. But it's going to require, even though we can learn in terms of concepts of openness, concepts of commons, etc., in application to certain of the challenges we face, we might have to approach it differently. And very quickly, I mean, the open data, the open government thing, which Kenya was, a big leader on, all the legislation's there, but there's literally no open data in practice. So it's actually the implementation that's the real challenge in the developing context. Sorry, longer than whatever characters.
So what I've heard is a really rich and broad ecosystem of problems, and I think that the immediate thing that I would like to see is the beginnings of an ecosystem map. So we have foreign policy issues, we have very local issues, we have global north versus global south, we have intersectionality, marginalization, academics, activists, and I feel like really the best that any of us can do is find our corner, figure out how to be effective, figure out how we can, what is the strategic way in which we can join hands to be more effective in particular contexts and then go at it. But the trouble with AI is that it's moving so fast that that information is not very organized right now. So I think that one of the outcomes that I would like to see from this space and this conference is an ecosystem mapping so that we can understand how individually and together we can manage to be as effective as possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the points that have been already made. I think that just adding a little bit to the last thing that Chinmayi was mentioning, I think that after we have that map, we need to be really strategic in how we use that map, in the sense that not everyone can do everything. Each area or each field of work, it's different and have their own advantages. So we need to work collaboratively to define the strategies and to allocate the task for each one in who we are better. And second and lastly, I want to just come back to the idea of this democratizing of the selection of the principles that we want to feed the artificial intelligence. But for doing that, we need to open first the black box, because as I heard yesterday in one session, we cannot find what is missing if we don't know what is inside. So we need the help of regulation, the help of the collaboration and conversation with the public and private sector to open the box.
So for me, I'm wondering if even if we get everything right, so let's assume we bake social justice into these systems and human rights and a lot of the values we care about, there will always be things we can't measure. Where is the friction that would allow us not to follow rules, which for me is a lot of what makes us human. And I just want to remember, some of you have seen it, Mimi yesterday presented a couple of artistic projects that raised awareness about these issues. A self-driving car in a circle, so it was in a parking lot, in a circle, a continuous circle was driven around it. And the self-driving car is programmed to say if there is a continuous line, you don't move, you don't cross the line, right? And so the car was stuck, right? As opposed to a human would say, you know what? There's nothing around me, I can drive. So I'm just wondering, even if we get the perfect sort of rules, where's the friction not to follow rules? Thank you.
So I'm just going to add to what everyone has already said by saying that in discussing how we also should discuss how AI would be regulated, not just globally, but locally within an accepted framework, right? That's also inclusive. I think we should individually continue these conversations in our respective communities and strive to collaborate further in building a more inclusive AI society, because the benefits are clear, and we just need to keep having these discussions and conversations.
So thank you to our great panelists, all 5 of them. Thank you, and thank you all for participating and listening to this session. The mic back to Becca. Thank you.